Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our board members, both online and in the room. Also to the Chief Constable, the Director General of the NCA, and all those joining us on the live stream of this Policing Board meeting today. Chief Constable, you have submitted a comprehensive report in response to the HMICFRS report. We are now, of course, aware that the Police Ombudsman is also conducting an investigation following a public complaint relating to the engagement of the PSNI with the organisers of the Black Lives Matter protest in Guildhall Square in advance of the event. The investigation will examine if this engagement was consistent with the PSNI's approach to the organisers of Bobby Storey's funeral. And of course, yesterday the PPS confirmed no prosecutions or fines issued. There are further questions from members today on this issue. Figures published for the end of the year show the impact lockdown has had on overall crime figures, trends and patterns. Over the last year, as part of the scrutiny of the measures set for policing in the annual plan, the board and its committees have been examining monthly reports on police performance and the outcomes being achieved against crime reported, along with the quality of service being provided by the PSNI. Despite the overall reduction in recorded crime, the increase in drugs offences and the continued high levels of domestic abuse crimes and incidents are of concern. New legislation was introduced by the Assembly which gives the police greater powers to deal with domestic abuse, and it is hoped that this gives confidence to all victims of abuse and violence to make the call to the police and to be assured that they will be given the support they need in reporting abuse or violence suffered. The figures cover a wide range of crime categories, and we have some questions again on that today. Also report around crimes committed in police stations and associated attacks on officers and staff, which we condemn. Again, as I've already said, we have the NCA Director General with us today, and there have been a lot of high-profile work by the NCA outlined in the latest reports which we have received. We've also received your National Strategic Assessment, which provides a comprehensive assessment of the changing serious and organised crime threat. I would invite you to comment on that further in due course. Chief Constable, you have also submitted a report on the policing of serious and organised crime. There have been some notable successes in recent weeks, which are to be congratulated. So we will take some opening remarks from both of you and then move to questions. So perhaps I'll start in the room with Simon, Chief Constable, ask for your remarks and then come to Dame Lynne. So Simon.
Well, thank you, Chair, and it's good to see everybody and also to welcome Lynne to today's meeting. Clearly, from our point of view here, the main issue before members is the response to the HMICFRS review and also to take some of the themes out of that report, where we continue to acknowledge, regardless of the dialogue and the debate, that notwithstanding the fact there's no prosecutions, that the hurt and the harm that some of the imagery we saw last year caused. But we also want to take the opportunity to thank HMI MAPPAR for the way he went about compiling the report. I know it raised a number of further questions, which we have tried to address as fulsome and in a way as we can in the report, which will not be put into the public domain for that reason, and also because of the ongoing new investigation from the Police Ombudsman. We've put the report around 5 key areas, which for members are outlined in page 3, and we also specifically address each of the recommendations that MAPPAR outlined to us when he presented the report to you a few weeks ago. They are grouped into areas of sort of immediate, within 6 months and within 12 months. And each of them will be managed through a governance process by ACC John Roberts, reporting directly to Mark in his deputy role to make sure that we do learn the lessons, we do sort of deliver on our commitments, and we put some of the issues quite firmly to bed. The report is 40 pages long, so it's quite fulsome, and we recognise that notwithstanding the approach that we've taken in relation to Matt's recommendations, that the issues raised go further than just the response to the funeral and actually some of the broader consequences. And therefore, to some people and some communities, our resolution, we recognise, will not be a quick fix. It's been well rehearsed in all sorts of different places, but I think it's also about understanding that we are not the only police service in the UK that has struggled with sort of getting the balance right between protecting public health and policing the COVID regulations, as well as other issues such as balancing human rights and indeed enforcing the law. In our report, we actually put members towards a national review of policing COVID that HMICFRS did prior to their work here, where they remind us that policing faced an extremely difficult situation of fast-paced announcements. And I think that reflects previous commentary I've made here about the dilemmas and dangers of fast-paced law. Clearly, the current investigation by Marie Anderson and the ongoing review by the Public Prosecution Service may limit some of the answers to questions today, but we'll try to be as candid as we can. I think, as well as looking backwards, I think the most important thing is to emphasise to people that we are listening. Towards the end of the report, we talk about 5 emerging themes from dialogue that I've had personally with political parties, with community influencers and others, which has been supported by other meetings across the piece, coordinated in a large part by temporary ACC Bobby Singleton. Those 5 themes I think are really important, they're contemporary, and I think they're really helpful, not just in addressing the issue, particularly in terms of some of the concerns expressed by the PUL committee, but given this is our 20th year, actually some considerations for where policing indeed is itself going in the future. So they're about recruitment, they're about getting better at engagement. Particularly important to us is about demonstrating procedural fairness, asking ourselves the questions, what does neighbourhood policing look like? What are the hallmarks of effective neighbourhood policing as we come out, hopefully, of the COVID era? And also working with yourselves and the PCSPs to ask questions, are there better models of local accountability, and particularly revisiting some of the ideas of pattern around local beat meetings. I think there's an opportunity for dialogue over the summer months with members here, but with wider afield to make sure we make that plan the best it can be, that it's commitments that are meaningful, tangible, and that we can deliver on, and we can report back to in due course over the autumn months. But I think we want to make sure that it's coherent and has the support of everybody. In relation to some of the specific issues that fell out of the recent report from Matt Parr, I think it's about emphasising that, to me personally, one of the matters of biggest regret was the considerations and criticisms about record keeping, which were disappointing professionally, to say the least. We want to take the lessons learned quickly, and indeed only next week, senior commanders, who we will see as the gold commanders for policing operations, will be developing their response to this through a professional development day, where we want to make sure unequivocally that people are singing off the same song sheet, as it were, and are following the doctrine of accredited professional practice that is outlined by the College of Policing. I guess recent events yesterday with the public prosecution announcement of no prosecution in relation to our enforcement of other protests in the COVID era does show some of the dilemmas that we are facing with. At its most basic, yesterday's announcements criticises us for being too robust in part in our engagement with people that were wanting to demonstrate and exhibit their rights. Similarly, the previous judgment actually in terms sort of reminded us that we weren't actually firm enough. So that does show some of the fine balance dilemmas and the real-time choices that commanders have to make in policing what were unique circumstances a year ago. I think what it reminds us that apart from those dilemmas, the difficulties that people have had to face with their best endeavours to support the public health regulations, to keep communities safe, as well as to preserve confidence in policing, which I highlighted in a letter that's recently been released into the public domain. We still want the unambiguous guidance to police as long as the regulations continue to make sure there are no more missteps, and recognise the benefits as well of early engagement with the PPS, which is in fact something we did on the Black Lives Matter prosecutions. In terms of other issues, and again particularly relevant with Dame Lynne joining us today, the good news that we put before members today in terms of some of the consistent work that we've done, working not just with the NCA as a key partner, but also through the work of Mark McEwen and his team, supported by neighbourhood officers and others, about the continuing success of fight against serious and organised crime. The report mirrors the time of reporting of the NCA issues, so there are obviously some recent arrests and successes, that we want to be able to sort of reinforce in the public domain. Whilst we have to be limited now in what we say, clearly the arrest just before the weekend in relation to the ongoing scams in relation to elderly people were really good news, as well as success this week in arrests in relation to the Inler show of strength in the Northwest. If you go to the report itself, there are some specifics I think we want to highlight. So in the reporting period, we've trebled the amount of drugs we've taken off the streets, working with Lynn and her colleagues, as well as developing our own intelligence. So that's risen from 6 million to 16 million in reporting period. So clearly a huge impact in reducing harm to communities and actually frustrating criminal groups that want to peddle drugs across our streets. We have to obviously now look forward to the next few weeks. Again, on the back of recent dialogue, we've been doing a lot of planning in a cross-ministerial group to prepare us for the policing issues that fall out of the July parades and bonfires. And only this week, I was able to meet the Orange Order to sort of listen firsthand to their plans, which have been now released into the public domain. We have quite a detailed policing operation planned with a senior officer running it, but Mark will be doing some work over the next few weeks to quality assure those plans to make sure that the sort of I's are dotted and the T's are crossed as best we can. Just in closing, Chair, to respond to a couple of comments in your introduction, I think it's fair to say that we remain concerned about the scourge of domestic abuse. It's been one of my personal priorities since the time here. There has been an awful lot of work done by policing to improve the amount of people that we're able to book before the courts, notwithstanding the COVID era, but also the work we're doing with partners across the piece to try and protect people at what is 1 in 6 of the crimes reported to us. So a significant issue just for policing, but also for the harm that it caused to wider communities. I think it's about caveating that whilst the rise in drug offences may be seen by some as a concern, that does reflect proactive activity, whether it's through stop search or actually more considered proactive operations. So in a sense, the more drugs that we seize are reflected in the crime figures. Similarly, the issue that was reported this week about crimes in police stations, to put into context, these relate to custody centres largely. So you will sadly see times police officers are insulted in custody centres and police staff, which is obviously unacceptable. But when people raise an eyebrow about sexual offences being reported, it is about unwanted touching towards officers and staff that are dealing with people that have been arrested. So that's sort of trying to explain that context. And finally, in terms of some other good news, we've now seen 4 senior officers meet the national assessment criteria to go into the strategic command course. That's, I think, I'm right in saying, in our 20 years, our best ever showing. So we congratulate them on their achievements, and they will go away for the command course in September, and that presents a real opportunity for the board in terms of selection decisions in relation to current vacancies that will be able to be addressed December, January of this year. So that's myself for now, Chair, and I'm happy to take questions once we've heard from them.
Okay, thank you, Simon, for that. We go straight to Lynn for your opening remarks, Lynn, and then we'll get to questions. And so, Dame Lynne Owens.
Thank you, Chair, and very grateful to the Chief Constable for his update. Just to echo everything that he says, our work leading the UK's fight to cut serious and organised crime is strengthened as a result of the very impressive and strong partnership we have with the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I just want to touch on the first point you made, Chair, which is about our publication of our National Strategic Assessment. We have a requirement in law annually to provide a public assessment of the threat that is faced from serious and organised crime. And of course, that impacts on every community across the UK. And I want to draw out for you what we think are the 5 big headings from this year's report, specifically as they relate to the communities of Northern Ireland. So the first is a point about the scale of serious and organised crime. What we have tried to do this year is to structure our assessment of that scale, which is something that boards like yours have been asking us to do for a number of years. So ourselves and policing and indeed other partners map people involved in organised, serious and organised crime. And this year we estimate there to be just under 70,000 people across the UK engaged in serious and organised crime. And we assess that to be an underestimate. One of the questions that we are repeatedly asked is about the scale of child sexual abuse, particularly those people who have a sexual interest in children. So the specialists in the National Crime Agency have worked tirelessly to develop a new methodology. It's different to last year's methodology, so the two are not comparable, but which seeks to assess the number of people who have a sexual interest in children. That's a very broad definition, from those who view images to those who actually engage in contact offending, both here and reaching and ordering it abroad through the concept of live streaming. But this year's estimate is that there is between 550,000 and 850,000 people who have a sexual interest in children across the UK. And of course, some of those will be based in the communities of Northern Ireland, as will the victims, the children of Northern Ireland. And then there is a third category, which is cybercrime, cyber-enabled crime and fraud, where I think we would say our understanding of the scale of that threat is not as good as it currently as it needs to be. And we're going to focus in next year's National Strategic Assessment on understanding that threat more significantly. The second thing this year's assessment tells us is about technology. So we are seeing a significant increase in ransomware that's been particularly enabled by the COVID crisis. So these are links sent to our computers or to our mobile phones to try and steal our personal data or companies' data, and often linked to offences of fraud. And it's great to see the success that Simon just alluded to in Northern Ireland this week. We also see that serious and organised crime is ever more global. Global supply chains, global markets, global networks, and therefore the necessity to protect the communities of Northern Ireland relies on the specialist resource we provide from the National Crime Agency that is based upstream and overseas. The fourth point is that serious and organised crime continues to be resilient and determined. Both Simon's report, the Chief Constable's report, and my report detail the extensive efforts made by both of our organisations to pursue offenders who target those who wish to commit the most significant crimes. But there is no doubt they saw COVID as an opportunity to target children online, an opportunity to commit fraud through fake PPE or through the distribution of ransomware links, or through the supply of drugs in which they, for example, disguise themselves as supermarket workers. And lastly, and specifically for Northern Ireland, we continue to see an overlap between counterterrorism and serious and organised crime, particularly the flow of firearms and the impact of illicit finance. So money made from serious and organised crime that is then used to fund other criminal activity. In this report, we have given you some headline statistics, just to summarise them. So the reports cover Q3 and Q4, so the second half of 1920, 2021. The Chief Constable has given you the headline drug figures, but specifically from the NCA, 21 kilograms of cocaine seized, 4 people sentenced through criminal court proceedings to a total of 17, just over 17 years imprisonment, 19 new operations opened, and of course, children safeguarded and firearms seized. Probably the most notable firearm seizure will be reported actually in next quarter's report, which is the 11 significant weapons that were located in your communities, which we assess as connected to serious organised crime. And other results too, which are spread throughout the document, including arrests and now charges in March, people involved in, we suspect, paramilitary crime, conspiring to supply Class A drugs, and I say charged now before a court. I shall leave it at that, Chair, because I know you are limited for time and will want to get on to questions, but thank you for your time.
Appreciate your reports and the detail within them, and there are lots of positive outcomes which we're delighted to see. We have a mixture of questions, some for the Chief Constable, some for the NCA, and I'm going to keep them mixed up rather than trying to separate them out. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But we're going to start with Michael Atkinson, who has a question for the Chief Constable. I'll ask him to ask that one first, and then to come to the NCA one, because I've got a supplementary then from Tom Buchanan after that. So Michael first.
Okay, good afternoon, Chief Constable, and thank you very much for your report and your perseverance in a number of areas here, and obviously some successes coming through as well, which is very good news. I wanted to focus in again, and you did mention it in your introduction, on record keeping and record keeping around significant events. Given the issues emerging from the Bobby Storey funeral, and I'm particularly thinking with a first forward look on this in terms of how things move forward. Just the context background was that in the report on the 30th of March, the PPS highlighted 2 reasons why the prosecution would not be successful in the case of the funeral. One of them was to do with regulations, which was largely outside your control, and the second was the nature of prior engagement and the policing approach on the day, which provided reasonable excuse for funeral organisers to assume no breaches. And arguably then this second issue was more within the PSNI's gift. The HMICFRS report then refers to a lack of comprehensive records of the engagement between PSNI and event organisers, and indeed the reinforcement of the 4 E's. In the PSNI report, the board today, you have provided information around the actions that you intend to take to address those issues around record keeping, areas of training, documentation improvements to engagement, etc. But I did want to ask you, in terms of whether you could advise us of the sort of urgency and structure which you intend to bring to the discipline around record keeping, and how that's being pursued given the likelihood of further events and gatherings in the shorter term, and noting the importance of having a solid auditable record of the understandings relayed to event organisers in such circumstances, and really what maybe your initial thoughts are around the protocol that you would want to establish in terms of future events and record keeping, please.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think just as a matter of public record, the PPS decision wasn't completely unequivocal. It said that our approach to engagement could, not would. And I do think that's a matter of clarifying that. But notwithstanding that, we are where we are. Record keeping, I say in my report and introduction, I think it is a matter of regret and is extremely disappointing. It doesn't change the fact that individuals assert what they said and did, but that's now subject to investigation. So I can't say any more than that. But in terms of the posture going forwards, I'm very clear, as is Mark, who I'm asking it sort of be the sort of gatekeeper on this, that we attach it to your report. It can be found in the public domain as well on the College of Policing website. But for both the senior commander, the gold commander and silver commanders, there are very clear expectations that people who are trained and accredited, because you go away on a course, you're tested, and then you get your accreditation over a period of time to show you as competent to lead the planning of policing operations like this. And clearly one of the bits of professional practice is about an audit trail of your decisions. So I'm absolutely clear in my determination to make sure that certainly going forwards that we abide by that, not just in the spirit, but the letter of those requirements. And the professional development day that will start next week, initially for the most senior officers, the gold commanders, so the assistant chiefs that largely police operations, as well as some of the chief superintendents, will address that matter head on. Mark and I are also going, although we don't directly engage in that activity anymore, we still have the opportunity to quality assure or seek assurances. So I want to make sure that we are all singing off the same song sheet and understand expectations going forward really clearly and simply.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that response. I mean, for what it's worth, I suppose my reflection on it would be that as part of that, or whatever emerges out of that discussion on your away day, you know, in an event like that, there should be almost like a single document produced somewhere that is referenceable and ticks the boxes as to what was said, the 4 E's was dealt with, and all that sort of thing, which makes it, you know, and the document you can't escape from. It has to be done, it has to be handed over to the event organisers, and it has to be put in a file somewhere. And I suppose it does feel to me that if there'd been something like that in place in this particular case, it might have taken a lot of the, you know, the problem away and the criticism away from this particular event for you. But thanks very much for your answer. Thank you.
Just very quickly, just to clarify, and I'll talk in general terms, there is a system we have called Clio, which is where we should record contemporaneous or recent decisions so that there's an audit trail. Okay.
Okay, Michael, can you ask your question for of the NCA now, please? Thanks.
Sorry, absolutely. I'll pick up on that NCA question. And Dame Lynne, the question really is around the toolbox at your disposal, I suppose, and particularly the legislative arrangements that you have as those relate to Northern Ireland. In June last year, the Justice Minister confirmed intention within Northern Ireland, this is to commence relevant provisions of the Criminal Finances Act 2017. And I wanted to ask you how the Director envisages those additional powers attached to the CFA to impact on efforts to tackle serious and organised crime in Northern Ireland. For example, the unexplained wealth orders, account freezing and forfeiture powers, for example. I'd be interested in your views on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I have to say we're very excited about the powers. I've been asked by the board about it previously when actually such powers were not available in Northern Ireland but were available in England and Wales. We have used both unexplained wealth orders and account freezing orders and then their subsequent measures to very good effect here. My Belfast branch is already briefed on the orders as they will come into force, and we look forward to using them to good effect to protect the communities of Northern Ireland, because we are very clear that crime mustn't pay and mustn't seem to be paying.
Just one supplementary there would be whether you see any gaps in the provisions in Northern Ireland at the minute, or areas that you think it would be helpful to have any further legislation developed.
From our perspective, we think the tools as they are constructed are good. The challenge that we see in the National Crime Agency currently is the level of legal challenge that is then made against the orders and the impact of that on core budgets of our organisation. And I'm guessing that myself and the Chief Constable will potentially see the same when we try to use the tools in Northern Ireland. So I think we just have to make sure that our organisations have the right capability to build the right cases and to take them through whatever legal processes we may be challenged through.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tom Buchanan, Tom, I think you have a supplementary on that, and then also a question for the Chief Constable. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And it was just on to follow up on that question, and Lynne, thank you for your report, and indeed for all the good work that's ongoing. But how has the delayed introduction of the Criminal Financial Act affected the work of the NCA? And have you any indication of the time frame for when all the new powers will be operable?
So the decision on operability of powers is bluntly not one for us. It is one for the civil service. All I can say is my indication is that they will be available to be used imminently. We stand ready to use them when they come in. There has been a gap in provision for the communities of Northern Ireland in a way that we haven't had a gap elsewhere in the UK, but we are ready to go.
Okay, thank you for that, Lynette. And Chief Con, in your response to the HMIC report, and there are some good things in it, as I'm sure my colleague Mervyn will reference later on, but you conclude with a wide sweeping statement that the approach taken by the PSNI on the day of the Storey funeral is the same approach adopted at recent protocol protests. I would like you to give us some clarity on how you reached that particular assessment, given that the PSNI presence at protocol protests has been much more visible. There's been much more closer proximity with police officers and participants, and these has been followed up by much more robust interventions, including letters, etc. So it's just some clarity on how you actually reached that assessment that obviously the same approach has been taken. And I did note where you have met with the Orange Order. And can you give us then give the board some indication that the same low level of policing as we saw at the Storey funeral will take place over the summer months? Because it's only action from the police and issues like this that will again help to build the confidence within the loyalists, the unions, communities, that there is no such a thing as two-tier policing as you continually spell out to the board?
Okay, thanks, Tom. I think there's a few bits there. Firstly, in general terms, as you go into the summer, it wouldn't be wise yet to set a blanket tone for a policing style, because that is driven by intelligence, the environment, context, and a whole range of things. And it goes back to Michael's point, actually. Generally speaking, the policing style is set by the requirements of the Gold Commander. So each different operational phase, that will be reviewed. But actually, if you look at July and the conversation we had the other day, it was about facilitating parades and bands across the country on what we think now is 70 to 100 different parades in July to go about their business, and that the policing style reflects that. You know, you will know yourself, in different places there'll either be issues around free flow of traffic. Assuming at the moment, there was a lot of discussion the other day with the Orange Order about abiding by guidance around social distancing, etc. But also recognising if, for example, there may be parades that are actually physically longer because of the desire to abide by social distancing or keep crowds apart, we've got to make sure that we don't then drift into any tensions around interface areas. So that, but the general tone is simply about officers that recognise the communities that they serve and what's going on, and can facilitate on those days effectively a decent and an important fun day out. In terms of the determination, I think there's two bits. In broad terms, it's always dangerous to compare two different types of events, regardless of some of the current debate and emotion, that how we would police a funeral in terms is different to how we were likely to police a protest, particularly when we're looking in the rearview mirror. What I was trying to say, Tom, and it's something we've rehearsed here a few times, is in broad terms, in this space, we've always gone along, despite the HMIC narrative, the 4E's approach, so that we will engage early, we'll try and understand and explain different roles and responsibilities, that regardless of what the context is, once you've gone through that initial stage of trying to understand ambition, set expectations and the rules, you then have, just as we've seen with some of the recent protocol parades, evidence gathering, and if we suspect there's breaches of either the COVID regulations or indeed any other matters of criminal law, we will launch an investigation. And that's what I was trying to say. Clearly, when you look at different issues across the country, there have been different approaches in terms of numbers of officers, but broadly, we're trying to be consistent, because as it would be reflected in conversations with some people in this room, but broadly further afield. The approach, I think we've now had 37 of the parades most recently that sort of overlap protest against protocol and two-tier policing. We haven't seen the sort of the resort to violence which fell out of the announcements from the PPS. And we have tried to work largely with people that want to engage with us to make sure that we encourage compliance with the law, but we will gather evidence in different ways. When you look at what went on the day of the funeral, it is not, there were no police officers there. And if you go into the report itself from HMIC Matt Parr, there was narrative from one of the inspectors that was part of the policing operation, so that the style and tone is different. It will be set between the Gold and Silver Commander, but broadly that was what I was trying to explain.
Thank you. Next question, and this one's back to Lynn again, the NCA, and Deirdre on EU withdrawal. Deirdre.
Thank you very much. This is around the impact of the UK's withdrawal from the EU on the level and practices of organised crime in Northern Ireland, and I suppose measuring the impact of this area. So I'd be interested in an update of the effectiveness of the tools and systems available to the NCA and other law enforcement agencies under the new trade and cooperation agreement, if you give me some scope there. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. As you know from previous appearances, we worked tirelessly in the run-up to leaving the EU in a number of ways to understand the change of the threat, to make sure that our hard-working international liaison officers were working closely with their operational partners overseas, and also to make sure that whatever arrangements were put in place, the UK was in the strongest possible position to respond. Obviously, since I last appeared before you, we have left the EU, and I'm pleased to say that the operational work between ourselves and our operational partners continues to be very strong. On the specific question about powers, we've worked with the Police Service of Powers and Tools. We've worked closely with the Police Service of Northern Ireland and the National Police Chiefs Council to ensure that everything that needed to be in place was in place. There are many of the tools that we still have access to. There were two areas where I know people were concerned. One was in respect of European arrest warrants, and the second was in respect of our leaving the Schengen Information System 2, so SIS2. On European arrest warrants, there is an alternative in place, but we do know that some countries are reticent about extraditing their own citizens under the new arrangement. The biggest implication for Northern Ireland in that regard would have been Ireland. But I'm delighted to say, as a result of the brilliant operational work that we have with the Guards, we have an international liaison officer based in Dublin, and as a result of attention of the government there, they have passed their own legislation, which means it's no longer a blocker. And that means that both the Chief Constable and I can give you confidence there is a route to extradite between both countries, which is very necessary. On the second area, Schengen Information System, the alternative for that is a route through Interpol. It's an Interpol update and diffusion process. I can tell you that we and the Police Service of Northern Ireland have ensured that all the information that we wanted to be uploaded into that system has been uploaded. What I can't give you at the moment is a sensible commentary about the effectiveness of that. And that is simply because since we've withdrawn from the EU, we have been under COVID restrictions, and therefore there have been much fewer numbers of people travelling. So I think it's early days to give you any assessment about whether it is working or not, but we shall certainly look to come back to that when we're seeing more free flow of people and goods.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Gerry Kelly.
Thank you, Margaret. Chief Constable, to the Chief Constable, and I want to ask a question about it was in the media that there was threats issued by the UDA against some political representatives. I want to know where that is going. Has anybody been questioned or arrested? And alongside that, could I ask a secondary question? And this is from a policing point of view. What would be your view in terms of partnerships between political organisations and illegal paramilitary organisations, which has also been in the news recently, and especially in your report, since you have named some of these organisations? Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Well, in relation to the former issue, we have commenced an investigation. So far, there has been nobody sort of approach to answer questions or has been arrested, but that's something that is now progressing through Mark McEwen's work in crime operations. In terms of the partnership that you're alluding to on politics, I just really sort of want to stay out of that and leave it in an operational policing space. We will police breaches of the law, whether you're talking about paramilitary crime or other organised groups. And I think anything further than that is a matter for the politicians, unless I've misunderstood where we're going.
I could come back, and I understand that you don't want to be drawn into politics, and I'm asking a policing question, which is if you're meeting a paramilitary organisation to ask them to disband, to stop their paramilitary activity, which is illegal, is one thing. To not do that, I presume, is a legal position, because I think it is illegal to talk to paramilitary organisations unless you're doing that.
Yeah. I think we got. I can see where you're going. I might just be marking because you'll have some experience of what we would have set the bar in the past, but the law is clear about relationships between a policing purpose for a meeting, for example, for ourselves, and indeed the responsibilities of others. But I know Mark Hamilton, would have gone through this in other years before we were here.
I suppose, Gerry, and I'm not fully aware of the nature of the background of your question, but if anyone is consciously meeting with anyone who's criminal for criminal purposes, and that's crime. But I don't think the law prescribes what you're saying as being a crime or not being a crime. I'm not aware of that. And certainly there's no law specific to the meeting of political parties or any member of the public. With paramilitary groups, obviously paramilitaries remain illegal under the law, and their membership of same is illegal, and the activities of them are illegal. And that's where the police investigate. We investigate against those parameters, both of ourselves, either into the counter-terrorism space for those involved in terrorism, or through the NCA into those involved in paramilitary criminality. I'm not aware of us having at any time had any locus into any other area of this.
Thank you, Mike. I think yours is supplementary to this, yeah?
It is, Chair.
Okay.
Chief Constable, could you confirm that the 2015 PSNI assessment of the provisional IRA still stands, and that the police believe the organisation still exists, still has a structure, including an Army Council, and that there are many in the Republican movement who believe that the Army Council continues to direct the political wing of the Republican movement?
Yeah, I think we stand by the 2015 assessment. We said that on a number of occasions here, and that's left there, I think.
Trevor, you have a supplementary on the same line?
Yeah, following on from Mike, I think there's a rank hypocrisy from the original questioner in this one here. Given now we've had it confirmed that the opinion still stands in relation to the 2015 assessment of the Army Council, we have a member of this board who is linked to a political party who is linked to that Army Council. So I think there's a rank hypocrisy in the original question of that. But going back then, maybe just expanding on that, and given the said member was very much involved in something that actually, I suppose, was probably one of the darkest days in this last number of years in terms of the public's impression of policing, and in terms of that member's involvement with that. We were just looking at the report you've had today, and there's obviously themes coming out, and you've accepted those recommendations. But given you've accepted those recommendations, and I think those could be also considered as criticisms of the police, is there going to be any disciplinary action in relation to the lack of record keeping and some of the other things noted in that report?
Well, first, in terms of, you've reminded what HMICFRS talked about, in that the bar wasn't reached in relation to any of the criticisms in terms of censure of people that were involved in that. We, as I said, Trevor, we recognised that there are issues where we need to be more consistent and to follow the doctrine that's outlined from the College of Policing. So that's why we've got the professional development days. I think beyond that, I couldn't answer at the moment, in fairness, because as we said at the start, the police ombudsman is now looking at a specific complaint, and we don't know whether she will finish her determination. So I wouldn't want to second guess that. Certainly, we won't be doing anything until she's finished her work, so we don't interfere with it.
Okay, thank you. Edgar, next question, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, this is directed to you. In the context of the hopefully significant increase in recruitment over the next year, both of police officers and police staff, I noted a comment from the Chief Constable of Northamptonshire expressing disappointment about the lack of life experience amongst recruits to his force, and also his criticism of the move, I assume, across GB forces to restrict new recruits to university graduates. We were advised previously in the Resources Committee about plans for a graduate level qualification being offered to student officers from commencing relatively soon. And it's really just to ask whether you have any plans to move more generally to graduate recruitment to the PSNI, given concerns that we all have about outreach and diversity in terms of appointments.
In short, no. Obviously, an individual chief somewhere else is entitled to their opinion, but we're quite content with the approach we've taken, which flips it effectively. There are pre-entry qualifications because we have to maintain some standards because to enable people to be able to assess information, gather evidence and process that. But for recruits now, they work with the policing college and then throughout their probationary period. So that the idea is whether you've got a degree for other reasons at the start or you just come in from another route, you'll end up with a professional qualification at the end, which I think is first class. So I think in relation to the broader question as well, that means that someone coming into the organisation on the initial start salary plus the likelihood of overtime because of the way we work here, we mean we're offering a career choice to people from across communities that brings you an income of circa £40,000 a year quite quickly, and also that professional development qualification at the same time. So I think it's a really good thing. I don't know if Pamela wants to say anything else, given our future plans, because we will recruit heavily this year.
Just a couple of things, Edgar, just follow on from the Chief Constable there. When we go out in our recruitment campaigns, as you're aware, we get significant applicants coming in. So by way of attracting people in, I think that's very positive. We will be bringing through the resource committee this month the monitoring information on the outworking of the last recruitment campaign, and I think you will find that very helpful. But as I'm even looking at your point around experience and age, again, the age profile of applicants coming through, even from 25 and above, is at 55%. So we are also attracting experience into the police and not sort of straight from school type recruitment as well. So, but we'll happy to pick that up at resource committee with you.
Sorry, Edgar, can you put your mic on, please? Thank you.
Yes. In terms of the entry qualifications, you're focused around GCSEs at the moment. Has there been any work done to look at equivalents for people who may have other qualifications which are not technically GCSEs but equivalent?
If I just pick that up a bit. Obviously we look right throughout. We've significant recruitment this year. Edgar's aware of 780 right across the organisation. And we would look at that equivalence, particularly to compare against A-level and so forth. So we would look at BTEC qualifications, we'd look at apprenticeships right across the organisation. So where there is a comparable benchmark qualification, that's something we consider in those roles. But GCSEs are sort of that base qualification at that stage of education that we consider.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving to Mervyn, who has questions both for the NCA and for the Chief Constable, I believe. Mervyn Storey.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Chief, for your report. The vile, grotesque organisation that was responsible for the murder of many innocent people, including those from their own community. And so I think a murder could reveal more of the truth as to who we should speak to or who we shouldn't speak to. And can I say, Chief Constable, there is now, and Mike has rightly, along with my colleague Trevor, raised the issue. 2015 was the assessment. We need that assessment revisited. We need to know who is in the Army Council, what their associations are, because the smoke and mirrors and denial and the shifting of blame needs to come to an end. And so the hypocrisy of some who stands in this meeting today, nothing new in that. Of course, we've heard it all before. In terms of the issue of your report, let me say I welcome the fact, while it's a detailed report and will take time to continue to consider it, I welcome the reference that we need to reset the dial in policing relationships and establishment engagement, particularly in relation to the Protestant Unionist and Loyalist community. I'm glad that you, as the Chief Constable and the organisation, have heard and are listening in terms of what needs to be done. I think that is vitally, vitally important. Also want to welcome the work being carried out by ACC, temporary ACC, Bobby Singleton, leading in terms of the specific programme, and particularly in relation to increasing the transparency, understanding, confidence in police decision making. As far as the issue of resource is concerned, and I want to really asked this question about the police have been very successful in recent times against Republican organisations, against loyalist organisations, whether it be in drug trafficking, whether it be in arms or whatever. Are you confident that the fact that we have an NDNA approach, we're still way short of it, we're way short of what was promised, it's not going to be delivered in 3 or 4 months' time. So NDNA, as far as policing is concerned, lies in tatters. And I think that I want to know that there will be no attempt to supplement the neighbourhood teams at the expense of detectives, at the expense of the investigation into people who need to be caught, who need to be put behind bars and put away because they are a blight in our society.
Thanks, Mervyn. In relation to the first piece, the assessment from 2015, I stand to be corrected, but I think my recollection is that reassessment is a matter for the Secretary of State. In relation to, I welcome the comments that you recognised that we are listening, as we say in the report, and we want to structure a response in relation to the criticisms that we've heard. The New Deal, New Approach, as you know, leaves us 400 short, and there was an evidence base that we put into the mix that justifies why we got to the figure of 7,500 police officers. I think in terms of our ambition, clearly last year saw the uplift into neighbourhood police officers, where for work that Mark began in a previous role and then was carried on thereafter, we've been able to increase the number of neighbourhood officers to just over 700, and I think we all see the benefits of that. Clearly, as you then allude to, there was always the issue about how we equip ourselves with investigative capability and intelligence development to help Mark McEwen and his colleagues continue to fight against terrorism and all forms of organised crime, and indeed some of the other threats that Dame Lynne was talking about in her introduction earlier. So we have an uplift this year of 100, and some of the work that Pamela's now doing is working across the piece to see that where we need to sort of invest some of that gap to close down some of our holes in that capability. Mark is also doing some other work to see how we integrate some of our investigative capability and also our disruptive capability. By that I mean things like TSG, dogs, the roads policing teams, because sometimes, as we saw last week, a chance stop in that road check where we recovered nearly £1 million worth of cannabis, can have as many benefits as a long-term proactive operation. But I don't know whether you want to come in, Mark, and say something about your plans to recruit more detectives.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's worth just putting on record, Chair, that we are already internally advertising phase 1, if you like, of recruitment into crime department. And that initial recruitment will be a number of 131 detective posts, and that's across a range of disciplines, looking at from the paramilitary crime task force, terrorist investigations through to local CID, and also looking at things like our cyber capability and indeed intelligence branch. So right across the gambit, we're already started that. As the Chief Constable said, we're looking at how we integrate blended teams more appropriately and more efficiently with the NCA, with Lynne's teams, and we're working very closely at that. As Dame Lynne said earlier on, relationships have never been better, and I think that the proof of the pudding is in the results that we've seen, not just in this reporting period, but right across the last year. So we are in a good position. We are internally pushing at the moment to drive that business on and looking at where we require that, where the most critical posts are, and getting those filled straight away. And then we're looking at what the growth might mean for us so that we can continue this sort of relentless frustration, disruption and dismantlement of organised criminality and terrorism.
And to Dame Lynne, can I just say a word of appreciation and thanks for the report. It is a challenge. Obviously, there are some issues of grave concern when we specifically hear the numbers in terms of those who express an interest in children and the exploitation. It is harrowing, to say the least. But in terms of, and it was mentioned earlier in regards to the legislative framework, And that's a very important tool in terms of the work of the NCA and the PSNI. But how equally is it important to ensure, Dame Lynne, that your organisation and the PSNI have the technical resources to ensure, because the cyber world, the world of the criminal now, is now gone beyond the balaclava and the crowbar. It is a very sophisticated world. And are you confident that you will, in either bids that you have made or will make, have the proper technological resources to be able to stay ahead of and be in front of those who are intent in causing such mayhem in our communities and in our societies?
Thanks ever so much, Mervyn. I touched on in my National Strategic Assessment update on the importance of technology, and we used a phrase when we launched our National Strategic Assessment about online is the new frontline, and for that very reason, I absolutely accept what you say. There is a need both for ourselves and the Police Service of Northern Ireland to build our technical capabilities, both in terms of equipment, kit, but also skills and understanding of the workforce. Employing data analysts and data experts is as important to me nowadays as it is those who are going to go through the front door and make arrests. And like you, I want us to take a very assertive approach to arresting those involved in this most serious crime. So the spending review round, I believe, will be announced either before recess or in the autumn. But our bid into that, which we will build alongside the National Police Chiefs Council, which of course the Chief Constable Simon is also a part of, will definitely have a strong theme of data and technology investment. It was great to hear Mark describing the intent to invest in cyber. We too see that. So cyber-enabled crime, fraud, illicit finance tracking, ability to track things like Bitcoin, all things that need investment. We have built some more capability in this year to examine what is going on the dark web, but again, areas that probably could and should be extended.
Thank you. Okay, back to some questions online. Dolores and then John Blair. So Dolores Kelly first.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to both of you for your reports. Can I ask the Chief Constable, you said how domestic abuse and tackling it was a priority for you. I just wonder then, in relation to the delays around the Justice Bill, what impact, if any, is that having on your ability to bring or to charge perpetrators more extensively or comprehensively than would otherwise be the case? And really, I understand there were some people who have been alleged to have committed rapes of children had jumped bail. I just wonder, is there any review of the mechanisms and how you hope to bring some of these people back into custody again soon? To begin with, anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Dolores. I think in relation to that last question, there was only one person we've identified that where bail was breached, and that was a registered sex offender, although we are carrying a wider ranging piece of work actually in relation to the monitoring and use of police bail, where we've seen significant, if you like, administrative improvements, which we can probably write to you about with a bit more detail. That's been led by the Criminal Justice Branch. In relation to domestic abuse, I think there's two bits there. Clearly, and this relates to some work that Mark was doing, Mark McEwen, in a previous role when he was running Public Protection Branch. A bit like Dame Lynne said earlier in relation to a question in relation to new powers to disrupt criminal wealth, we remain sort of ready for the changes in relation to domestic abuse in terms of coercive control and some of all the other issues that you touch on there. I think to reassure people though, I said more than one occasion, domestic abuse makes 1 in 6 of our crimes. So it's a significant issue for us in terms of volume, but also the harm it causes to individuals and indeed the wider families that are affected by it as a crime. But we do recognise the fact that we've made progress. So one of my sort of personal talisman indicators is what we would say is domestic abuse that cause violent injury, because sometimes other forms of crime are harder to prove when there's only 2 people involved in it. But we have seen month-on-month improvements in that, which again, I think are picked up in committee when we report there on crime levels. where the charge rates are more impressive and also stand scrutiny, very good scrutiny actually, with other parts of England and Wales. So we want to work with victims to have the confidence to come forwards, to see them through the process. And indeed, as was referenced only recently, when myself, the Permanent Secretary, and Stephen Heron from the DPP's office presented to the Public Accounts Committee our determination to do all we can to speed up justice for victims. We've seen delays as a consequence of historical practice, of legislation. So, for example, the issue around committal reform, as well as the impact of COVID. And we want to make sure, as that works its way through the system, as much as other legislation, that the victims who are harmed in domestic abuse settings get speedier justice.
Chair, I had tabled a number of other questions, so I'm happy to take a written answer to those. But could I ask the Director then, obviously one of the impacts that many are anticipating around lockdown is an increase in addiction. And, you know, even at local level here, all our villages, everywhere is awash with drugs, whether there are the illegal drugs or indeed prescription drugs that are obtained illegally. I just wonder, in terms of the focus of both yourself and the Chief Constable in relation to reassuring communities that is a key target, not only the high level interception, but the black market online and indeed within local communities. It's something I'll be meeting my neighbourhood team about next week at local level, but it is a huge issue, and I think one that both mental health services and yourselves will see the aftermath, I believe, of some of the challenges around COVID.
Thanks for the question, Dolores. We will go after serious and organised crime in whatever form it takes. So if that is the illicit supply of legal drugs or the illicit supply of illicit drugs, criminals are in it to make money and also to cause harm. The Chief Constable and I both in our updates highlighted that the supply of drugs into communities is our priority focus for both of us. We are absolutely working hand in glove to try and intercept it upstream at the border and then in communities. The Chief Constable updated on the brilliant stop search that led to the seizure of cannabis. So it needs everything from the international to the local joined up on both illicit supply, in whatever form it comes. You may recall I've spoken at this board before about a very significant case we had that ended in prosecution last year connected to the importation of large-scale quantities of anabolic steroid with Northern Ireland as the port of choice for that importation. Again, that would have all been due in local communities. The drugs themselves not illegal, but the quantities in which they were arriving were. So, in every respect, we would see illegal drugs as a priority for the reasons that you say, the impact they cause in community harm. We see the harm in two ways. We see individual harm that you've just described, sort of mental health issues, ill health, and in the worst case scenario, death. But we also see it connected to violence in communities. So determination between drug dealing gangs to take one another's territory and to use violence in that regard. And for that reason, it gets priority through both lenses.
Thank you. We're coming to John now, and I also have indication of questions from Joanne. If there's anyone else, Frank, yeah, just got you there, that's okay. If there's anyone else online, just indicate with a hand up or in the room and we'll pick up those. But so the last few questions now. John, up next, John Blair.
Chair, thank you. Can I start by, like others, on behalf of my party, thanking Dame Lynne and the Chief Constable and their respective agencies for the recent successes against organised crime, in particular relation to drugs, weapons, actions to thwart the exploitation of the vulnerable. And we know all of that was done in the interest of public safety. Chair, much policing attention, moving on to a separate issue in recent times, and we've been reminded again today, yet again, has been based around the policing of COVID and public order. But we know too there are other arising and ongoing issues. The Chief Constable will be aware that I tabled a written question recently in relation to serious online threats against individuals, including journalists and their families. And it should be pointed out that some of those online threats were particularly vile. I want to thank the police for the reply that I received, but I thought it might be useful to receive an update in public session also today, so we could hear about any progress being made, any work that's ongoing, and also if there are any legislative challenges in relation to this that we as a policing board could help address.
Yeah, and if I may, I'll just point Dolores to page 7 of the organised crime report in relation to drug seizures for an earlier comment. But well, thanks for the commentary, John. In relation to the sort of some of the evidence we've seen in the public domain recently of quite horrible threats to prominent individuals, we deal with it in different ways. So all of it is through Mark McEwen's world in crime. So we've tried to learn from the last few years that we have consistent senior investigating officers to coordinate responses. So whether that's sort of either threats or other means of sort of attack towards senior figures in the public space, as in politicians, but also the specific issue of threats against journalists and what it means for freedom of speech. We've got specific responses. In the journalism space, we do now have a journalism safety officer, which I think would be reflected in your letter. And Chief Superintendent Sam MacDonald is also feeding in to UK-wide work in relation to the approach, the consistency of the approach, and indeed legislation. There is some issues here in relation to mostly, and it's difficult to sometimes set blanket policy in a public meeting, but we would welcome some modernisation of some of the legislation, because at times our efforts to track people down and actually arrest them are reflected in the fact that the legislation that we will sometimes rely on is a summary offence, which inhibits where we can go in terms of arrests. I don't want to say too much more in relation to specific offences because of ongoing investigations, but it's a bit like when Dame Lynne was talking before about effectively the better powers that we have, the more we can speed up. And I think that would be something. There was an earlier question, I think, on other legislation. We will welcome support for modernisation, whilst recognising in the likely timeframes of this assembly how realistic that would be. But there's certainly something in relation to the Communications Act we would welcome. But I don't know if Mark wants to say anything else around the specifics or that, as in Mark McEwen, about what we're doing, or you've had enough of an answer there, John.
Thank you.
No, I don't think there's much more to add, particularly around the specific investigation that John's referring to.
Okay, thanks both, and for the previous reply as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joanne.
Thank you, Chairman. Chief Constable Dame Lynne, thank you very much for your reports. I have a few areas of questioning, if that's all right. My first relates to organised crime gangs. We obviously know about the local issues that there are, and we get reports with regard to that. But I'd be interested to understand the ratio of homegrown OCGs. I understand that you have responsibility for 72. So the ratio of homegrown against international organised crime gangs, if and how they work together. And I note in your report the statistics with regard to frustration and disruption, but could you also please give us some indication of the impact of all of the various task forces activity on the actual organisations themselves towards dismantling? Thank you.
So I suppose we answer in part, and I forget, right, you took something from Lynn as well. Yeah. Well, the report, you quite rightly say that we assess 72 organised crime groups at the moment, and the bulk are involved in drug trafficking. There is obviously other illicit trade, be it sadly people or through to other forms of contraband that they'll be involved in. I think we've previously reported to the board, and we can get more detail, Joanne, in relation to how we've looked at some crime groups that will be largely within the island of Ireland, others that will actually have a reach into other parts of the UK, and indeed others that go far beyond that. And some of the most present examples, sadly, have been around people smuggling. We now, because if you remember about, well, when I came here, actually, we commissioned the joint review with Lynn's team, with our crime operations branch, of our approach to tackling serious organised crime, where we went through over 50 recommendations to sort of improve our approach and bring greater synergies, hence some of the similar sort of nomenclature we put in the report today about frustration, dismantling, etc. Sometimes the actual impact is hard to fully assess because there's definitions in the report in terms of what that is. And equally, sometimes the surrogate measures can be as unsubtle as changes in prices of different drugs. And you'll see in the report really sort of some of the changes in drug misuse over time. But do you want to say a bit more about how you're running the sort of the approach, Mark, in terms of tasking and impact, both internally and with Lynn's officers?
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying, as you can see in the report, 35% of disruption relates and the OCGs relate to those action through the paramilitary crime task force. There's very little in the organised crime world now that doesn't go beyond the geographical borders of the jurisdiction. And that's why it's so key that we work very closely with NCA. One of the real notable seizures was in Uri as part of Up Fusion, as part of our looking at the hauliers. And it's in the report there, the significant seizure and arrest and charge that was carried out there. Very quickly, that brings us back into mainland continental Europe. And so we action that through our partnership with the NCA. Then look at the other structures that we have in the JATF, working with colleagues in An Garda Síochána. And we have been looking at all of that with the OCTF, the PCTF. How do we streamline that? When you talk about the overall aggregated impact, Joanne, so we will come back to the board with that in the future to talk about the impact of that. But also then for ourselves working with Lynn's people and in An Garda Síochána with their network through Europe, how do we get best bang for our money in that regard? And again, then it is about us accessing the capabilities that the NCA bring to the table and others bring to the table, and working with district partners to get that sort of middle and lower level attritional activity ongoing against these groups. Suppose in short, it is a really cluttered landscape, both in terms of how we're actioning it, and we will streamline that now, but as I say, because of the cyber enablement of nearly every part of this, and just the European network and the international network, it's critical that we work with our partners. And you really, it would be hard pushed to pick a group and say it's solely a locally organised business.
Lynn, would you like to, sorry.
Just on that as well, it might be just before we bring it, because it affects to something Lynn and I have been discussing as well. It may be for a future meeting, there's a chance to explore more our thinking around the crime campus as well. There's a capital side that Pamela's working on, but there's, we've shown really today, and I'm sure you'll judge about the benefits of close cooperation, information sharing, and swift responses. But Lynn, I'm speaking for her in a minute, but we both feel the benefits that we could realise around proper co-location of not just the paramilitary crime task force, but a whole range of other capabilities in one place. And that would be something, again, we'd welcome the board's support on bringing to life.
Absolutely. Lynn, would you like to comment now?
I can't do a better input than the Chief Constable and Mark have just done. I completely sort of recognise everything they described. We just don't see any more organised crime groups just operating in a specific geographic location. They are enabled by technology. They can reach across the whole of the UK and across the whole of the world without having to leave where they currently live and operate from. So for all the reasons Mark quite clearly articulated, this has to be a complete join up between the international and the services we provide there, the national and then regional into the Police Service for Northern Ireland. As Simon has just said, he and I have been talking about the development of a crime campus. I think we would see huge benefit from that, and the agency would support any conversations that the policing board want to have in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. If we could just move then to, I suppose, part of Lynn's report, which was the horrendous statistics around adults who have a sexual interest in children. On the back of that, and on the back of the detail in your report, I'd be grateful to know from the two of you, if possible, some indication of the relevant numbers in Northern Ireland. And then more than that, when we previously discussed this the last time Lynn was here, I had asked questions around safeguarding, referrals and so on. And at the time, I think, Chief Constable, your answers to me had phrases in them like, we're at the tip of the iceberg and we're going to scratch the surface because it's such a massive problem. Have we made progress?
Lynn?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
So in terms of the scale, as I said in my introduction, it is a horrific scale. It's last year's number was based on specific intelligence as a result of a scrape off the dark web and some other areas. This year, what we've tried to do is extrapolate that against an academic model. What that means is I can't say to you on the range of 550 to 850, we think 200 of them are based, or 250,000 of them are based in Northern Ireland, and it would be wrong of me to try and guess that. The reason I say that, the reason that matters, is because actually the threat can come into the children of Northern Ireland from anywhere in the world, and I think it's one of those crimes where actually the geographic presence of the offender actually doesn't matter. We know there are children who have been abused by offenders, or whose abuse has been enabled by offenders in the United States, in different parts of the UK. And it's this methodology where you can be on something like this, you can pretend to be somebody else online, you can get a child to share a indecent image, and then once you've got hold of that image, you can then persuade that child to abuse siblings, to self-harm, to very high extremes. And it's that which has been, I think, a real change in the methodology of child sexual abuse. So this ability to be anywhere in the world and to cause that opportunity. On local safeguarding, I'll let Simon give a view about how he feels the local partnerships are going. What I would say from a National Crime Agency perspective is we very much rely on the support from what we call our CEOP ambassadors, so the Child Exploitation Online Protection Team, so part of the National Crime Agency, and both the PSNI and your local partners have been very active participants in those schemes. So my sense is there is a growing realisation within communities of Northern Ireland that this is a serious problem. But Simon may have more on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I think it'd be unwise to sort of give absolute quotients here at the moment, Joanne, because we could set a whole train of other things running. I think it's a bit like the previous question. I'll sort of mirror what Dame Lynn said. I think there's probably two other specifics I'll probably draw you towards. I mean, I stand by the previous comments. I think, some of the statistics we've heard from the NCA today are stark and quite terrifying, frankly, about what may be happening in the privacy of somebody's home with such huge, both short and indeed longer term consequences. I think some of it, I can't really go into too much detail in the public domain, but we touched previously about it may be for members to come to sort of Mark's world in relation to the cyber centre to see some of the tactics we're doing, but I wouldn't want to talk about much than that. To give you some reassurance, we're trying to complement some of the work that Lynn will do with her people. And similarly, the overall picture, I think, again, it might be working out with the chair, the chief executive, the right committee to bring our strategic assessment to. We try to mirror the approach of the crime agency in terms of tone and quality. Obviously, we have to make decisions here about priorities and where we put resources. And that might be something we can bring to a future committee so you get that assurance that we're identifying not just the high-level crime risk, but some of the other policing challenges and how we push resourcing against that. So that's something we can speak outside about.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
There's one more, and this one's much more positive, actually, that will be of benefit to members too. First of all, I would declare my membership of the RUC-GC Foundation, but recently some of us had the opportunity to attend a Zoom ceremony whereby recipients of the bursary scheme from the foundation were able to share with us some of the learning and some of the projects that they have taken forward. And for members' benefit, some of the subjects were things like safety considerations for high-risk situations, experiences of vulnerable persons in contact with police, mental health provision for officers dealing with trauma and the illegal trade in animals across the border. So a lot of really good, useful learning that can be taken through and can benefit the organisation as a whole. So my question to the Chief Constable is, how does he plan to roll out that learning across the organisation?
Well, thanks for that. And it was one of those shames of COVID, wasn't it? Because we participated in the inputs and it was probably frustrated by the fact you couldn't actually be together, because there was some fascinating stuff. Those products will now go into the relevant core departments for action, whether it's community safety or into Mark's world. And I think it's fair to say in here it's about paying tribute to Steve White for his leadership and determination to get the benefit from the bursary. We are determined to make sure that as we go forward, officers continue to apply for it, to get the benefits, not just from the knowledge. I think the networks, you remember, I think the input around the organised wildlife crime is just one example. And it may be, again, through a committee, we can bring a bit more detail to what we've been doing. And we continue to look forward to the relationship with the foundation and some of the work that Pamela's doing at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. We are definitely over time, but very finally, a question from Frank. Frank.
Very finally, thank you, Chairman. And this question, most of it has already been answered, and it's for Lynn and it's for Simon. I worked in the telecommunications business for 40 years, and I lived through, along with everybody else in the culture, amazing advancements in technology and the adoption of it. And it was always designed to be good, but with the advent of the dark web and the deep web, I genuinely believe that we've let a genie out of the bottle, that we're going to find it extremely difficult to get back in. And that harm's going to come to our children today and children of generations and the age of generations, unless we, and I'm talking we in Northern Ireland here, try to do something different and throw resources in and funding in or whatever. Anybody, any suggestions, I suppose, as to what we could do to try and stop this before it destroys our society?
Thank you. I'll let Lynn speak first, and then if any of Simon's team want to come in. Lynn.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Frank. So it's important to say that the technology and telecom sector have to be important partners of ours. I think it is critical that we require private industry to design things from which they make money in a way that doesn't allow crime to prosper. And I'm not sure, I think we've been a bit timid, to be frank, to get that balance between privacy and security. And, you know, as a law enforcement professional, both those things are important. They need to operate hand in glove. Real benefits of encryption, you know, protects our data, protects all of our data, but actually if it's done clumsily or in an ill thought out way, it can close the door on intelligence about child abusers or terrorists. So I think that would be the first thing. I think there is a sort of moral and ethical responsibility on telecommunication and technology providers to ensure they design systems that do not enable crime. And that's probably some more that the board can do there. Of course, the UK government are currently looking at the online harms bill, and be worth the board having a look at that and taking a view on whether you think the provisions in that are currently in the right place. I do think there is more that we could do to build capabilities ourselves, and then jointly with PSNI that could look more closely in this space. Very content to sort of give a private briefing to the board on what we are doing in this area. I wouldn't want to talk about it on open forum because I simply don't want to expose the tactics to others. But you really would be very welcome to come and see what we do. And then in that we could describe how we think it could be grown or further developed.
Okay, thank you. I think we will definitely take you up on that offer, Lynn, and see find out what's going on. As you say, I understand that the necessity not to say too much in public session. Anything else, Simon? Are you happy to leave it there?
Well, it's a pretty profound question, really, isn't it? And I suppose when you project forwards about impacts on policing, allocation of resources, skills, capabilities, as the world around us changes, it's one of our challenges to keep up. I think it's about just quickly building on what Lynn said, because I think it's fundamentally the issue about not saying too much about specific tactics and what we do and don't do. I think the broader issue I would encourage it, and Lynn referenced it both in legislation and in some of the public narrative, is about recognising that whichever bit of the internet and the modern age, there's benefits and risks. It's about regulation and those checks and balances. Sometimes that regulation might be about our powers and equally about the responsibilities of providers and how we actually police the open source world in the internet as well as the dark web, because it's not just, I know there's specific reference to child abuse, but it's also exploited for other sort of nefarious and very sinister means. There's an issue around education, I think, as well, about, and we touched upon this a few times, not just young people, but all of us, how we operate properly in that space, and also acknowledging the work of the UK Cyber Centre. So that's another part of the sort of the national armoury, if you like, in terms of trying to disrupt people with malintent in terms of using sort of the modern world to attack infrastructure and the use of ransomware.
Okay, thank you for that. We are finally at the end of our meeting, and thank you to Dame Lynn for joining us. Hopefully, Lynn, next time you'll be able to be here in person. I know we said that the last time, and it still isn't the case, but hopefully by the time we meet up again later in the year, it will be in person. I'm glad to say that the sun that you have had shining behind you the whole way through this meeting seems to have finally arrived in Belfast, so we may be allowed out of our darkened bunker here and the blinds pulled so that we can see the daylight again. But thank you also to Simon, Pamela, and all of the Marks for attending today as well and taking your questions. We meet again in public on Thursday, the 1st of July, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you to all who have joined us online, and have a good day. Thanks.